Cuba has had a remarkably low number of COVID-19 cases and deaths throughout the pandemic. The island nation has 11.3 million people and has suffered just over 1,000 deaths due to COVID-19. Compare that to the nearby Dominican Republic, which has 10.6 million people, but twice as many COVID cases and 3 times as many deaths from the virus. Or how about New York City? We've seen over 33,000 COVID-19 deaths here, with a population of 8.4 million people. Cuba's extraordinary success is due to its planning, wherein medical providers, scientists, and government prepared for worst-case medical scenarios. In addition to planning, Cuba's socialist culture structured collaboration among hospitals, clinics, research centers, scientists, local communities, and the state. And unlike in the United States, Cubans respect and rely on science. Cuba's fierce, world-class medical system is a product of the Cuban Revolution, whose principal task was to provide top-notch education to all Cubans, as well as access to free, high-caliber, comprehensive, and universal medical care.
Cuba has developed a world-class healthcare system, haciendo malabares, against all odds, in the context of a U.S. embargo put in place after Cuba's 1959 revolution, and which the U.S. has reinforced and renewed during the pandemic in an attempt to bring the island to its knees. But next week, on June 23rd, the United Nations General Assembly will consider a resolution to put an end to the U.S. blockade against Cuba. And here to talk to us about the blockade and the upcoming UN vote is Yaima de Armas. Yaima de Armas is Second Secretary at the Permanent Mission of Cuba to the UN, in charge of administrative and budgetary affairs. She has a BA in English Language and Literature from Havana University and a postgraduate in International Relations from the Raúl Roa Higher Institute for International Relations. Yaima de Armas, welcome to A New Day.
Hi. Thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thank you so very much for joining us this morning, given that you have a full plate. So let's get right with it. How did the UN vote, which is set for next week, come about?
Well, it's based on the fact that the UN, first off, and especially the body within the UN where this vote takes place, is safe to say the most democratic body in the globe. This is the place where all member states, all nations come forward to express their needs, their hopes, their aspirations for themselves and for humanity at large. So in 1992, Cuba, in the face of the increasing pressure from the U.S. government at the time, with further sanctions and further laws, in this case, the Torricelli Act that was enacted in 1992, looked to the UN, and in this case to the General Assembly, for support against this illegal and unjust policy that was being strengthened at the time. And in that regard, the Cuban delegation, on behalf of the Cuban government and the Cuban people, we submitted this resolution for the consideration of our fellow member states. And we saw that evidently there was a support there for this very just claim from the Cuban people. And ever since, this resolution has been submitted under each session of the General Assembly every year. And we have increasingly received more support. The resolution in and of itself has no binding effect, legally speaking, but it does show how isolated the United States government have become over the past years, and we're counting now. Next Wednesday would be the 29th consecutive time that this resolution is to be considered by the UN General Assembly, and of course, we hope so, and we trust so, that it'll be overwhelmingly supported by the international community. Because at the end of the day, that's what the General Assembly does. It provides that status of the state of opinion of the international community, and in the best of cases provides a scenario or a stage where other colleagues of the international community are encouraged and are called upon to abide by international law. And in this case, it's a call to the U.S. government to put an end to the unilateral embargo blockade that has been in effect for more than 60 years now.
And what are some of the countries, or which are some of the countries that stand with the United States?
Well, the voting records are clear on this. This has been an evolving matter. Today, unfortunately, several countries have not followed their traditional position of support to this important element, to this important resolution and item. The traditional countries that have been in step with the United States has been Israel, and of late some countries have not supported the resolution, but we do trust that, again, the overwhelming majority of the international community will support and validate our just claim against this illegal blockade.
So can you talk to us about the blockade and its character? What does it mean, the blockade? What is blocked exactly?
Well, basically, the blockade against Cuba is a very complex amount or amalgam of laws and executive orders that have come together to form this wall around Cuba in many ways. There have been successive measures implemented against Cuba and repeated amendments to what's called the Cuban Assets Control Regulations applied by the U.S. government that confirm the validity of the laws and regulations that support overarchingly this blockade policy. I mean, we can start with saying, for example, that the U.S. government applies against Cuba the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. This is something that's applied to barely any country in the world, and Cuba is one of them. There are many other regulations and acts that support this policy from the U.S. government. The two the two laws that came about that really strengthened the blockade at one point were in 1992, the Cuban Democracy Act, or better known as the Torricelli Act, which prohibits subsidiaries of U.S. companies in third countries from trading in goods with Cuba or Cuban nationals. It also prohibits third country ships landing in any Cuban port from entering the U.S. territory for 180 days. And then came in 1996 the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, actually known as Helms-Burton Act. And this was the law, a piece of legislation that actually codified all these provisions of the blockade and ended up extending the extraterritorial scope of the blockade by imposing sanctions on heads of foreign companies who carry out transactions with what they call U.S. properties nationalized in Cuba, and also allowed for the possibility of filing lawsuits in U.S. courts. So there are other pieces of legislation that compose the U.S. blockade on Cuba, but these are like the most known because of their severe impact in codifying and cementing the blockade policy against Cuba. And actually, through these legislations, for example, it was at a point where the President of the United States would have had the capacity of, through an executive order, to roll back or tear down the blockade in its entirety. But unfortunately, these laws approved in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, have prevented this. Therefore, today, a full elimination of the blockade against Cuba would require congressional approval. However, there is quite a number of measures that could be repealed through executive order, and that's something that that we're hoping will happen, taking into account that over the past 4 years alone, the previous U.S. administration, Trump administration, enacted over 240, in only 4 years, 240 measures devoted to strengthening the blockade against Cuba. And all of these were done through executive orders. So, as you can see, there is a lot that even through executive orders can be done, but also a lot that needs to be done through the support of the U.S. Congress.
And as you're speaking, Yaima, I'm thinking about the Periodo Especial, given that the Helms-Burton Act was passed in 1996. That was a period of very, very unforgiving economic hard times in Cuba, and I imagine that Helms-Burton really deepened that crisis because it was passed in 1996.
Indeed, ever since this law has been passed, there has been very little respite in that sense, and it's been up to the Cuban government and the Cuban people to forge their way in trying to overcome the constant obstacle that is the U.S. blockade against Cuba. And of course, we couldn't do that without the support of the international community. There's this slogan at one point that came about during the Obama administration, that Cuba was finally opening up, but Cuba was never closed. We were always open. We were always open to our friends, to our colleagues in the international community. It was actually the other way around. So in this sense, we have tried to move forward because if Cuba had, for example, the payment capacity it has lost to the blockade in less than 5 years, for example, the country could go a long ways towards bringing much of its infrastructure up to date, and could in particular change the national energy mix we have in favor of renewable energy sources. If the amount of money that the blockade costs to the country were available, we could turn our financial situation around, boost the confidence of foreign investors and creditors, and substantially increase access to financial and capital markets. I mean, when you look at the economic impact that the blockade has had, at current prices, the losses accumulated in almost 6 decades of application of this policy, and bear with me, the numbers are large, amount to over $147,853 million. That is quite a significant amount. If you take, for example, the depreciation of the dollar against the price of gold in the international market, the embargo, the blockade has caused quantifiable losses of more than 1.3 trillion. So those are not small numbers. Those are very significant numbers. But of course, these numbers never show the full picture of what the blockade causes for the Cuban people. You could never quantify human loss. You can never quantify the impact this cruel policy has on the lives of everyday Cubans. all day, all year round.
You're listening to the voice of Yaima de Armas, who's the second secretary at the permanent mission of Cuba to the UN, and she's in charge of administrative and budgetary affairs. And we're talking about the longstanding U.S. government blockade against Cuba and the upcoming UN vote to put an end to that blockade. I'm Johanna Fernandez, your host of A New Day, joined by Ellis Maxwell as co-host, and you're listening to WBAI at 99.5 FM in New York.
Yaima de Armas, you've talked to us about the large-scale structure of the blockade, and you touched on this just a moment ago, but can you tell us more about the impacts of the blockade on Cuban society, and what does it mean every day for Cuban people to be living with this blockade?
Thanks for the question. Indeed, it's amazing how the resilience of the Cuban people in the face of such a strong and comprehensive set of sanctions that is accurately recorded in history as the longest set of sanctions against any country. In that sense, I mean, I was giving you numbers earlier on, but just as another case, for example, from just the period of April 2019 to December 2020, we're talking a year or so. The amount of damages, economic damages to Cuba, have been in the order of $9.1 billion. So that is when you consider that number, you consider the size of the economy of Cuba, you can understand how the level of negative impact that this policy has. The blockade represents definitely a huge burden for our population and our economy, with particularly devastating effects owing to the current COVID-19 pandemic. We have been forced to allocate considerable resources to urgently secure necessary equipment and materials for our national health system when we could have easily purchased many of those equipment and materials just 90 miles away, aka here in the U.S. So the impact of the blockade on our health sector has been one of the hardest hit during these few years, and it's been seen in shortages of essential consumer products, as well as difficulties in our national industries in accessing the necessary supplies for example, food preservation, drug manufacturing. You were speaking earlier in the introduction of the show, for example, on how we've managed the COVID pandemic, and though we are very worried about the loss of lives we've sustained, and of course we want to avoid that as much as possible. We have been seeing of late the promise of our vaccine candidates that we have developed and that we are using with our population, and in that sense we have great hope for this, but that takes a lot of effort, and that takes a lot of supplies to produce those vaccines, as well as to get those shots in the arms of Cubans, and for that it would definitely be an easier path to have that direct line of trade with the U.S., which is one of the main medical suppliers in the world, but also to not have that persecution on our transactions and banking operations and trade operations with other countries and third country companies, which is the case, which has been the case for so many years. So in essence, I could give you so many examples of how the U.S. blockade is hounding us and is preventing us from developing our industries, from achieving sustainable development. But in essence, in the past few years, it has been focused on increasing these measures and has really led to a number of losses in economic terms that everyday Cubans do feel. Like, for example, there's a rough estimate that the blockade causes approximately from 12 to $15 million of losses every day, per day. So just to give you other examples of what's been happening, the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act has been activated, which brings the possibility to bring claims under it. There's an increased persecution of Cuban financial and commercial transactions. There's the prohibition of flights from the United States to the other provinces of Cuba except for Havana. The intimidation of companies that send fuel supplies to Cuba, and of course a campaign to discredit our Cuban medical cooperation programs. These are some of the very few things that have been happening and that definitely have an effect on our development.
Yaima de Armas, thank you so much for the clarity that you've offered and the information you're sharing with us here on a new day. And before we let you go and get back to the very important work you're doing, we would like to know on this show always what inspires people to continue doing often the very heart-wrenching but also important and visionary work that they're involved in. So I'm wondering if you can give us just a sense of what makes you excited to come on this show this morning, even with, I'm sure, a busy day ahead.
Well, thank you so much. First off, it's the opportunity to reach out to people, not only in the U.S., but wherever they're listening in onto the show, to really have that small chance to let them know what we're doing, that this is a just cause, that this is the lives of over 11 million people trying to overcome this barrier, this very unjust illegal blockade that exists for over 6 decades now, and to try and get more and more people to care about the lives of the people on my island, and to get them to see, if they don't know it by now, that the Cuban people are always welcoming to others. We don't close our doors. We're always welcoming to people, and we're always ready to talk, to engage with respect, with kindness, but also with that sense that we are equals, that we can talk about anything and everything, but always on the basis of that respect and equality. And definitely because it has been, in my case, I was born and living under this blockade, and so is the case for the majority of the Cuban population today. So it is our hope that one day, not only through the pressure and the public opinion of the international community at the UN, as will happen next Wednesday, but through the continued engagement of everyone, from anyone who's listening today to people in other places that could help to promote the end of this policy by the U.S. government, which is a unilateral policy that should be lifted right away.
Yaima de Armas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I hope that everyone listening out there takes an interest on this, and of course we're always ready to give more information on how this policy came to be and what's going to happen next Wednesday.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We stand in solidarity with the island of Cuba.
Thank you so much.
Wow. Ellis. Yeah, I mean, it's unrelenting and unforgiving punishment of the Cuban people and their fierce self-determination, right? What is democracy and freedom if not self-determination? And what right does the United States have to impose this kind of death, really, an attempt at imposing death onto an entire people? It just gives you a sense of the vicious character of U.S. imperialism and ultimately its capitalist interests.
Absolutely. We just heard from Yaima de Armas, Second Secretary at the Permanent Mission of Cuba to the UN, in charge of administrative and budgetary affairs, speaking about the long-standing U.S. government blockade against Cuba and the upcoming UN vote to put an end to it. I'm Ellis Maxwell, joining Johanna Fernandez as co-host of A New Day. You're listening to WBAI at 99.5 FM in New York. And I was thinking about also the kind of suppression of the information that we shared in our intro and that Yaima de Armas referred to, the way that Cuba has handled the pandemic, despite this blockade, in the face of it. Obviously, in New York and all over across the country, at the start of the pandemic, there was all the hysteria about not having enough PPE. And this whole time, there's been U.S. sanction blockade making it even more difficult for Cuba to secure PPE. And yet, because of the healthcare system and the effort from the start put into controlling the pandemic, the numbers of cases and deaths are minuscule compared to what we see here. But that's not a story that we hear a lot or at all in U.S. media. And so in addition to that, the economic blockade, there's also this media blackout that seems to compound any or prevent any notion of solidarity from emerging except through independent, organized media and except through solidarity.
And Ellis, those numbers are shocking. The island has 11.3 million people, but it suffered just over 1,000 deaths due to COVID. And compare that to New York City. We have a smaller population of 8.4 million people, and we suffered 33,000 deaths.
30 times as many deaths.
It is shocking, and it shows you who really cares about people, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the Cubans who care about humanity and people and health. And yet it's depicted in the media as Dr. Evil, when in fact the opposite is the truth, is true. But I want to call attention right now to a solidarity march with Cuba that's happening precisely on the day that the UN Assembly, the UN General Assembly, is going to vote against the blockade, the U.S. blockade in Cuba. So on the very same day, on June 23rd, there's going to be a march at the UN. Folks are going to gather and rally at 4 p.m. At the Cuban mission, and they're going to march to the UN, and the address is 315 Lexington Avenue. 315 Lexington Avenue between 38th and 39th Streets in Manhattan. So there's a flyer here. It's a solidarity march, Wednesday, June 23rd. The gathering place is 315 Lexington Avenue between 38th and 39th Streets in Manhattan. And the gathering time is at 4, and this event is from 4 to 6. And it's a solidarity rally and march from the Cuban mission to the United Nations just around the corner. So folks should join next Wednesday, the 23rd, in solidarity with Cuba if anything you heard has moved your humanity to essentially support the people of Cuba. Please join them next Wednesday.
Absolutely. And I'm wanting to read messages from our loyal team here. Michael G. Haskins says, the West wants to punish Cuba just like Haiti because of the revolutionary spirit of the people. Marcos Maldonado Cruz says they just want to make examples of runaways, like always. This is the kind of response that we have to bring here, is to understand. I mean, we talked about Haiti earlier this week. This has been a week full of U.S. imperialism and resistance to it.
It has, and we didn't plan it this way. It just fell, what's the word I'm looking for? This is just the way it randomly came together. I think for the last 2 weeks there has been an enormous emphasis on our show on Latin America. And I was talking to one of our producers, Marcos Maldonado Cruz, about it. And he said that, well, if you think about the continent, the U.S. is really in the demographic minority. And geographically, the United States is but a sliver of what we see in terms of population in the continent. So in many ways, having an entire week dedicated to Latin America really properly puts the importance and significance of that continent or that part of the continent in our listeners' ears. But also, there's the issue of U.S. imperialism, right? That the United States is the small part of the continent that has a disproportionate impact on how people live across it.